originally Facebook, MySpace, Friendster, it was just like, look at me, here are the bands that I like, here are my friends. Nothing toxic about that. But 2009 to 2012 is when you get the like button, the retweet button, algorithmicizing the news feed. So now it's a lot more about putting stuff out there and no, you're terrible, and I can't believe you said that, and you retweet, you distort things and make fun of people. So it becomes much nastier. And it's Gen Z, and especially Gen Z girls, are the ones who suddenly get depressed and anxious. So I'm in a debate now, I can't say that this is established fact, but I'm in a debate now with other researchers as to whether social media, early entry, getting on at 10, 11, 12, early entry, I think, is associated with, it is associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety. That's another thread. Then social media has a variety of other effects. It just makes everything much more explosive.
I'm here this afternoon with Jonathan Haidt, the Thomas Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership at New York University Stern School of Business. John, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Rob.
There's so much we could talk about, but being an economic institute with many curious young people following our work, I'd like to step a little bit through your evolution. How did you get from studying psychology to being interested in capitalism and morality, which I think is the theme of your forthcoming book?
That's right. Yeah, let's start there, because it's a kind of a circuitous path, and especially if you're thinking about young people watching this, a theme that I learned when I was trying to figure out my way is that there are so many twists and turns and coincidences, and that's what happened to me. So I went to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1980s and early 90s. I studied morality and how it varies across cultures. And I was really looking across nations like Brazil and America and India is where I did my original research. And it was after I went to India in 1993 and tried to understand this sex-segregated traditional society, I came back to America in 1993, and for the first time, I felt I could understand conservatives. I was always on the left growing up. I hated Ronald Reagan, and I hated the religious right, and the Christian right was getting very powerful in politics. And when I got back from that trip to India, it had opened my mind that conservatism is not the devil. It's a different moral order, and there are all these different moral orders. And that was really the beginning. That was the most important intellectual event in my life. So I began studying how America is divided almost as if we're different nations. And the cultural war was really beginning to heat up in the 90s. The left and the right were like different nations with different economics books, different American history textbooks, different views of reality. So I'm studying political polarization, and it gets worse and worse. And I, after the Democrats lose 2 elections in a row to George W. Bush, I couldn't stand it anymore. I said, I'm not studying cross-national differences anymore. I'm using all of my work to help the Democrats learn how to speak about morality. I wanted to strangle Gore and Kerry. They had no idea how to talk to Americans about morality. They kept saying, well, my program will get you more stuff. My program will get, no. The presidency is a quasi-religious office in this country. We have the American civic religion, and the president is supposed to be the high priest, at least at times, a job that the current president is spectacularly bad at. So I start writing memos about how the Democrats could apply moral psychology to win more elections, and nobody reads them. I have no contacts. But I decided to turn that into The Righteous Mind, and so I write up this book, which originally was, again, it was going to be like how to help the left understand this broader moral domain that they were missing a lot of. And as I got about halfway through writing the book, and as George W. Bush left the White House and Barack Obama came in, and so a lot of my sort of anger or hatred of the right was abating now, I had a kind of an epiphany as I was writing the book, realizing, oh my God, by throwing myself into reading libertarian and conservative writings, the best writings, not the worst, which is what you find on the internet, but the best spokesmen, I realized there are all these ideas that I'd never known about. And that to understand how society works, how markets, how capitalism works, you can't just stay in your bubble. And so that's what really opened my mind and made me just really curious about all these different ideas. And so I wrote The Righteous Mind, and I moved to NYU just so I could be in New York City to promote it. I was able to get a job at the Stern School. I knew nothing about business. I didn't even have much interest in it at the time. But it was a way to pay the rent, and I taught business ethics. And as soon as I got to New York in 2011, Occupy Wall Street broke out. And so suddenly the whole world is now talking about capitalism, politics, and morality. And I start learning about capitalism. You know, I was 46 or 47 years old, very well educated by American standards, which means I knew nothing about capitalism. I'd never read anything about it. And I got a series of lectures by Jerry Mueller. He's an intellectual historian. He had a set of lectures in the Teaching Company, and I'd used his work to write The Righteous Mind. And when I read the history of capitalism, it just completely blew my mind. It was like when I first had read about evolution. And you see how, you know, a few simple principles and the vast complexity of the economic or built world suddenly unfolds before you in the same way as when I had read Richard Dawkins in college. Like, oh my God, now I understand evolution. Like, look at all this variety of animals and plants. And so here I was at Stern. On the one hand, the world's imploding, economic inequality is exploding, and all the terrible things being said about business and capitalism are true. On the other hand, wealth is going up historically around the world, rights are expanding, and all the good things being said about capitalism are true. So that's what that kind of, okay, there you go. That's like 20 years condensed into a few minutes. But that's how I got to be applying moral psychology to economics and capitalism.
Well, early on, you had a very, how would I say, a paper that I think is where I first interfaced, which was about the emotional tail.
The emotional dog and its
emotional
rational
dog and
tail.
the rational tail. Yes. Describe that metaphor.
Sure, because that's to the extent that I've done original research myself. It's on two major points. So the first is, what is morality? And when I was in graduate school, everybody was reading Lawrence Kohlberg, who studied moral reasoning, and everybody was looking at how does moral reasoning develop, and how do children learn to reason in a more adequate way? But I had I don't know if it was a strong intuition or what, but it just seemed to me this was kind of, the reasoning was not where the action was. It was really in the emotions and the gut feelings. I'd been a philosophy major in college, and I particularly liked David Hume, who said that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. And I thought that sounded a lot more right than sort of emphasizing reasoning. And so I played around with various psychological models that were dual process models where you can have emotion, you can have reasoning, and they go against each other, but I could never get them to work because the intuition, the automatic processes always overwhelmed everything else. So anyway, my emotional dog paper, in the 90s, when I first got my first faculty position at the University of Virginia, I was running experiments, trying to manipulate reason and emotion, and I came to see that actually it's the emotion, or rather more broadly, the intuition, the quick gut feelings, the automatic intuitions. They come first, and importantly, they structure the space within which reasoning takes place. So you might be actually reasoning about something about abortion or gun control or taxes. You might be reasoning. But as soon as something's presented to you, your automatic processes have already shaped what matters. They've already structured the space on which the argument will take place, and so the conclusion is almost preordained. So I wrote that all up in a review paper that I sent into Psychological Review, which is the top theory journal, laying out, basically saying Hume was right, and here's just more detail on what Hume said, and here's a review of all the different literatures in evolution, in cognitive psychology, in developmental psychology. Here's a comprehensive theory of humans as these intuitive creatures that make up reasonings post hoc. And also, that's when I got the idea for what became my first book, The Happiness Hypothesis. The metaphor there was that the mind is divided like a rider on an elephant. The rider is our conscious reasoning, which is system 2. And the other 99% of what goes on in our minds, the neural network, the automatic processes, that's system 1. Or I thought of it as like being like an elephant. So not a rider on a horse. I wanted an animal that was much bigger than a horse and much smarter, so I picked elephant.
I'm always curious. I looked this morning as I was preparing for this at the outline of the presidential agenda in 1956 of the Eisenhower Republicans. And it looked an awful lot like what Barack Obama would say.
Right.
What's changed? I know we'll talk a little bit about how technology affects things when we talk about younger people in your most recent book, but what changed this constellation of principles that are in the righteous mind and what people grabbed onto. Why did it seem to become more extreme, more violent, more polarized? What,
You mean American politics?
American
since the
politics,
Eisenhower
as
days? Yeah, that's
you know,
right.
you're burrowing in as you've come back from India and others you described, and you're seeing this intensity,
that's right.
repulsed a bit by it, but it feels like it
it's
wasn't
really
a
changed
constant
since
that you
the
just tapped into.
That's
Something in that process rose to the fore.
That's right. So you have to look at politics, or I'd say any complex system, at multiple levels of analysis. So you have individual human beings. Each one has a particular temperament. And a general finding in political psychology is that identical twins, born separated at birth, raised in different places, they're going to grow up to have similar politics. They're going to either both be on the left or both be on the right. Not perfectly, but politics, like a lot of other things, is very heritable. And it's because they have a certain temperament. And so, for example, if you have two kids and one has a very neat room and always makes deadlines and is orderly and responsible, odds are that kid's going to vote Republican, or I should just say conservative. Whereas if you have one who's more all over the place and looser and maybe more fun, but not as well organized, that kid is likely to end up being a progressive. And so we could go into why that is, but the point is that's at the level of individual. But the political parties, those are shifting agglomerations of interest groups that evolve over time. There are accidents of history, like the fact that the Democrats were the party of the South. Therefore, the South would never vote for a Republican. Either, so you have all these historical reasons why parties either don't move or do move. The thing that's happened that a lot of people are pointing to, and I think Ezra Klein in his new book really puts this out really clearly, that parties were always agglomerations of regions and interest groups and manufacturers and merchants, all that stuff. But in the last 30, 40 years, 20, 30 years, they've become much more sorts by personality and values.
Well, you've written a book about how it's gotten worse at the college campus level.
Yes.
How does technology play a role in feeding that polarization, and what has it done to young people?
So I wrote this book with Greg Lukianoff called The Coddling of the American Mind. It began as an article in The Atlantic. It was Greg's idea. Greg noticed that something's going very, very wrong, something's very strange about on some college campuses. Greg runs the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. It advocates for free speech rights for college students. And for the first time, Greg began noticing around 2013, 2014, it was the students themselves who were asking for protection. Greg's whole career had been spent pushing back on administrators. And now college students are saying, we won't be safe if this person comes to campus. This book makes us feel afraid. Ban it, get rid of it, warn us about it. So safe spaces, microaggressions, trigger warnings, all that stuff. We'd never heard of it until around 2014. And suddenly the students are acting as though they're fragile, as though they'll be damaged. And this was something new. And Greg noticed that their justifications were actually just like the distortions that he had learned to stop doing when he was treated for depression. He had very severe depression in 2007, and he learned cognitive behavioral therapy. So this was Greg's initial insight, and so we wrote up this article about this weird kind of thinking that showed up on college campuses around 2014. Article comes out in August of 2015, and then at Halloween 2015, all hell breaks loose, first at Yale, when Nicholas Christakis' wife writes what seems to be a very supportive, friendly email about Halloween costumes, and that blows up into a giant conflict, and then that conflict spreads to dozens or a couple hundred other universities. So it was as though a new moral matrix or new moral arrangement had appeared on elite college campuses in 2015. And then it spread very rapidly, and it led to enormous amounts of conflict and a loss of trust. We don't trust each other. We have anonymous reporting mechanisms so that if someone says something offensive, we can all report each other. It really has sucked the trust out of the academic world.
Which breeds caution?
It breeds a lot of self-censorship. So I'm very careful in what I say in class. Students say they self-censor a lot. And the academic world used to be, it was never a fully isolated zone, but you need a space away from the public square. Each area of human life has to have its own norms in order to pursue its telos or purpose. And for the pursuit of truth, you need a lively and vigorous debate. If you say something, I need to be able to say, no, I don't think that's right, and here's why. But we had an inflow of sacred values and ideas that are untouchable, especially around race, gender, immigration, basically all the hot button issues of political debate. So when the norms of the public square come into the university, then the university can no longer serve its function. And that's what I think, that's what Greg and I think happened around 2015. So why did that happen? There are a lot of threads that come together, but the two that you asked about are, one is the rise of depression, anxiety, and the other is the rise of a new kind of hyper-partisanship or polarization. So the depression, anxiety is amazing. We didn't know it then. We didn't understand it then. There's a giant wave of depression, anxiety hit American teenagers in 2012. It comes seemingly out of nowhere. If you track, and I've got at the website at thecoddling.com, we track all the studies showing this. The rates of depression and anxiety for young women and young men are pretty constant, and then suddenly in 2012, the rates for women go way, way up, and the rates for men go up a little. Gen Z, that is people born after 1996 or so, Gen Z showed up on college campuses around 2014, and they brought with them very high rates of depression and anxiety. And if you're anxious, ambiguous things pop out at you as a threat. And so if a conservative organization on campus invites somebody to speak, normally for the millennials, they would have just said, I'm not going to that, and that's the end of it. But some moral entrepreneurs would say, this is an attack on us. We are all in danger. They're denying our existence. And then suddenly you have these protests, like trying to actually stop someone from speaking, like not arguing against them, not saying they're wrong.
Those are different forms of resistance,
Yeah, and so this is an incredible violation of academic values, to try to silence other people, to stop them from speaking, to stop your fellow students from listening. Anyway, so I'm not saying all the students doing the protesting are depressed. What I'm saying is that certain ideas about words as violence, words as threat, the college campus as a dangerous place because of words, not physical violence, those all made sense to Gen Z students when they didn't make sense to the faculty, and almost everyone's on the left on the faculty. So there was just complete incomprehension. One strand of it is that we began vastly overprotecting kids in the 90s. We literally stopped letting them out. We thought that they'd be abducted if they were let out. And I grew up in the 70s and 80s at the height of the crime wave, when it actually was dangerous, but everybody went out and played. And then just as the crime wave ends in the 90s, we freak out about child abduction, which was never really an issue. But we freak out about it and we keep our kids in. So we have kids who didn't get the chance to develop normal independence. They're more fragile, therefore they're more easily spooked. They don't have practice negotiating conflict without adult supervision. So they arrive on campus, around 2010 plus or minus. They begin arriving on campus. That's one thread. The other thread is that social media becomes much more toxic between 2009 and 2011. Originally, Facebook, MySpace, Friendster, it was just like, look at me, here are the bands that I like, here are my friends. Nothing toxic about that. But 2009 to 2012 is when you get the like button, the retweet button, algorithmicizing the news feed. So now it's a lot more about putting stuff out there and no, you're terrible, and I can't believe you said that, and you retweet, you distort things and make fun of people. So it becomes much nastier. And it's Gen Z, and especially Gen Z girls, are the ones who suddenly get depressed and anxious. So I'm in a debate now, I can't say that this is established fact, but I'm in a debate now with other researchers as to whether social media, early entry, getting on at 10, 11, 12, early entry, I think, is associated with, it is associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety. That's another thread. Then social media has a variety of other effects. It just makes everything much more explosive. So when I was young, I might be wrong about this, my recollection is, every month there'd be a new outrage about the Republicans, like, oh, I can't believe that Nixon did this, or I can't believe, maybe it was once a week, I don't know how often it was, but it wasn't every hour.
Well, John, it's been wonderful to have you here, and not only for this discussion, but you set an example of widespread curiosity. I'm always reminded of Alan Watts, the Englishman who majored or specialized in Eastern philosophy. And Alan Watts wrote a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity. And in that book, there's an exercise where he says, if you took out, every time you're anxious, you took out a yellow pad, you'd write a strategic plan for your life. If you, in your life, put it in a drawer, all of those plans, when you were 70, you'd look at them and you would laugh because none of them bore any resemblance to the trajectory of your life.
Yeah.
But I've watched your writing, and in talking with you, I see this constant kind of intensity of curiosity. And I think that's a wonderful thing to emulate. I think you set a very good example for the young people in our Young Scholars Initiative, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Bye.